Second reading from Scripture this morning, verses from the letter to the Hebrews, the 11th and the 12th chapters. It was by faith that Abraham obeyed the call to set out for a country that was to be the inheritance given to him and his descendants, and he set out not knowing where he was going. By faith he sojourned in the promised land as though it were not his, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked forward to a well-founded city designed and built by God. So with so many witnesses in a great cloud all around us, we too then should throw off everything that weighs us down, and with perseverance keep running in the race which lies ahead of us, keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus, who leads us in our faith. It's strange, incredibly strange, how this history of ours, the civilization of which we are all part, really began with a move made by a 70-year-old man with a barren wife 3,000 years ago. But that really is where it began, where we began in the way we think and feel about life even to this day, in this faith that is ours. If you want to read about it, if you have difficulty plowing through the Old Testament, let alone understanding it, and who doesn't, I would encourage you to read the latest volume by Tom Cahill entitled The Gifts of the Jews. It's a fun romp through the Old Testament, yet scholarly enough. In any event, here's the way he tells the tale. So Abram went, two of the boldest words in all history. They signal a complete departure from everything that has gone before in the long evolution of culture and sensibility. Out of Sumer, civilized repository of the predictable, comes a man who does not know where he's going, but who goes forth, nevertheless, into an unknown wilderness under the prompting of his God. Out of Mesopotamia, home of canny, self-serving merchants who use their gods to ensure prosperity and security, comes a caravan with no material goal. Out of an ancient humanity which from the dim beginnings of its consciousness has read its eternal verities in the stars, comes a party traveling by no known compass. Out of the human race which knows in its bones that all its strivings must end in death, comes a leader who says he has been given an impossible promise. Out of a mortal imagination comes a dream of something totally new, something better, something yet to happen, something in the future. And the New Testament calls that faith. The willingness to risk, to leave nation, tribe, and family, that is, to leave the safe, the secure, the known, on behalf of a dream of a new and better tomorrow. By faith, Abraham went out, not knowing where he was going. This old faith, which has given us our civilization, our way of life, you see, began not with creedal statements or philosophical speculations or with ethical imperatives. It began with a certain posture toward life itself. At its most fundamental, it understands faith as the courage to move out into an unknown future against our fears. And it began with this man who felt deep within the compulsion to leave the settled and the secure, leave his ancestral home, all that was familiar and reassuring and comforting, and to go out into a dream, into an adventure, to go out not knowing where in the world he was headed. And it's the same faith and vision which fired a young carpenter, a son of Abraham, to leave family and familiar village and to go out and confront strangers, fishermen, tax collectors, and challenge them to go with him to shake the world to its roots. It was the same faith that charged up Paul and Barnabas to march across the very map of the empire, to risk their lives that others might learn the same courage and faith and hope. And you know, it was very much the same vision and courage and faith which drew European poor to the boats and brought them to this risky and insecure and unknown land to build a better city. Marlene and I rode in a taxi to the airport recently. The accent of the driver led me to ask where he was from, and he said a town near the Black Sea. How long had he been here? 9 months. What did he do in Russia? He was an air traffic controller with a very high grade and responsibility. Why did he come here? Well, he was an Armenian Christian. His wife was Russian. She'd won the silver medal in the world gymnastics. But one day the Cossacks had come into their home. This happened within the last year, and tore it up, literally destroyed it. And he decided to come to America. No family, no friends here, knew nothing of where he was going. But through his wife's sports activity, they had contacted a gymnastics teacher in Buffalo Grove that she'd run into at one point in time. Now his wife is working out in Buffalo Grove hard on her English day in, day out, so that she can teach perhaps while she cares for their child. And he used his last dollars to buy a cab. They live on almost nothing, but I don't worry, he says. I have faith that we can make a life here. He went out not knowing where he was going. But really, that's kind of the spirit that made our country what it is. But my question this morning is that the broader mood and spirit today? Are we still a people of that kind of faith and courage, or are we not increasingly a people who put security and comfort before risk and adventure, who do not want things disturbed, things are going well, let's not rock the boat? It is an unpredictable, threatening, constantly changing world out there, and the drive for passion and passion for some safety and some secure harbor for the mind and body is understandable. But there's also a problem here. The passion for security can lead to avoidance of necessary risk, can mean the unwillingness to take the right kind of chances in life. In a cover story some years ago in the New Republic, the late Henry Fairley, in my mind an astute observer of the American scene, laid out what he calls America's growing and morbid aversion to risk. He writes, "The idea that our individual lives and the nation's life can and should be risk-free has grown to be an obsession driven far and deep into the American psyche. Indeed, the desire for a risk-free society is one of the most debilitating influences in our country today, progressively enfeebling the economy with a mass of safety regulations and a widespread fear of liability rulings, and threatening to create an unbuoyant and uninventive society. As many studies show, this is strikingly an American phenomenon, one that seems to have taken root in yet another distortion of the philosophy of rights underlying the Declaration of Independence, to include freedom from risk among the other self-evident rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This morbid aversion to risk calls into question how Americans can now envisage any kind of future that speaks of hope and promise. He goes on, if America's new timorousness had prevailed among the Vikings, their ships, with the bold prows but frail hulls, would have been declared unseaworthy. The Norsemen would have stayed home and jogged. Columbus' 3 tubs would have not been allowed out of port. In fact, one was left wrecked on American shores. The Vikings and Columbus were exploring what was as unknown to them today as our solar system is to us. And it's not only the practical achievements of such venturing that are frustrated by the desire for a risk-free society. Something of the questing endeavor of the human spirit is also lost. He goes on to tell about a woman who sued the New York State for not keeping the public beaches safe because she was hit in the neck by a frisbee thrown by a 9-year-old boy. In the Washington Post, I discovered this piece by Lynn McGee, who puts this penchant, this growing mood in a somewhat lighter vein, this desire to keep everything nailed down. It all began when the dental hygienist who was scraping the tartar off my teeth asked, "Do you spend at least 4 minutes each time you brush your teeth?" With a gurgling tube hanging from my lip, I responded, "A little less than that." "You really should," she said, "or you'll lose all your teeth." I vowed to myself that I would floss, pick, brush, and rinse as instructed. At my annual physical exam, the doctor asked, "How often do you exercise? Do you limit your salt intake? Does your diet contain much cholesterol?" I thus began an intensive fitness program, which I checked off on the daily personal maintenance schedule on my refrigerator door. I then made an appointment for a beauty makeover. "When was the last time you had a facial?" the cosmetologist asked. Never didn't seem like quite the right answer, so I hedged with, "It's been a while." You should have one more often, she said. You already got some terrible wrinkles around your eyes. Mentally, I added, get facial to my personal maintenance schedule. I soon learned personal maintenance was not all that I had to worry about. At the appliance repair shop, the clerk examining my coffee maker asked, do you run white vinegar through it each month? Thus began my home maintenance schedule, which took its place next to my personal maintenance schedule. Several other appliances began demanding my attention: the tape deck in my car, the VCR, the disk drives in my computer. I soon found I was sleeping 4 hours a night, had lost touch with my husband and children, had no social life, not to mention no room left on the refrigerator door. It all came crashing down one night when I was reading an article entitled, "Are you endangering the lives of your loved ones by failing to dust your smoke alarms regularly?" I ran to the refrigerator, tore all the schedules to shreds, and in their place I've established a policy of responding to all questions by taking the Fifth Amendment. Now what's at stake here when we lose our capacity to accept that life has a certain amount of risk, when we're no longer willing or able to thrust ourselves into situations which may involve a little bit of insecurity, we close ourselves off to creative endeavors of any kind, as a matter of fact, whether in the world of work or child rearing or leisure pursuits. To have children is risky. To get married is risky. I suspect that's why many get married later and later. Most meaningful accomplishments, most advances of human spirit in life require the toleration of a significant degree of uncertainty. James Michener writes, in 1941, I was stuck on a remote island in the South Pacific. To kill time, I decided to write a book. Then I was told some cold facts that the chances against anyone publishing a first book are 95 to 1, but I decided to stick my neck out and go ahead. Then somebody told me two more facts. If someone hasn't written a book by the time he's 35, chances are he never will, and I was already 40. Even worse, I was not writing a novel, but a book of short stories. And a friend warned me nobody publishes books of short stories anymore. Even so, I still decided to stick my neck out. When the book appeared, it caused little comment and would have died unknown, except a fellow by the name of Orville Prescott, a newspaper book reviewer out on the West Coast, took a chance on a beginning writer and reported that he liked the stories. Later, a group of literary critics studied the book and pointed out it's not a novel, it's not about America, and common sense says it's not eligible for the Pulitzer Prize, but let's give it to him anyway. So it came to other attention. In Hollywood, a Kenneth McKenna, who reads books for the movies, tried to persuade his company to make a movie out of Tales of the South Pacific, but his expert consultants replied, no dramatic possibilities. So McKenna brought the book to the attention of Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein in New York City. When Broadway heard that Rodgers and Hammerstein planned a musical called Of All Things South Pacific, the wiseacres cried, have you heard their screwy idea? The romantic lead is going to be a man past 50, an opera singer with a name of Itzio Pinza, of all things. Well, you know what happened. And he concludes, you can understand why I like people who stick their necks out. But one has to wonder how much our lives would be impoverished of art and literature, of technology and marvelous experiences if increasing numbers continue to spend their days playing it safe. Americans have historically been an inventive, exploring, adventuring, risk-taking breed. And how sad if we lose that in the mania for risk-free existence. One of the problems the German government is currently having with the OCs, that is, those who lived for 40 years under communism in the eastern part of that country, is their intense discomfort with a world wherein they have to risk a bit, depend more on themselves than on the government. And 1/3 of them long for the security of the good old days where they had a guaranteed job and guaranteed free health care and a guaranteed home. But there are other areas where the inability or unwillingness to risk courageously are even more deadly, appropriately from the pulpit, that we don't often think of in connection with this business of risk. It is in our relationships with one another, for example, that the acceptance and the embrace of a little bit of risk is essential to creative relationships, to relationships that grow, that go somewhere, that expand with the years? How many of our young people miss out because they cling to the little clique where they are comfortable rather than reach out to the new or different one, the potential friend? And where do they learn that if not from parents who function very much in the same modality? How many individuals live lives basically of lonely isolation because they are afraid to run the risk of reaching out? Newsweek magazine quoted David Trump some years ago as saying, "I hate to have to rely on friends. I am not a trusting guy. I prefer to rely on myself." Now, I don't know Mr. Trump, of course, but that sounds a lot like fear before the risks inherent in the courage it takes for real relationship. How many married people keep their relationship within safe, if boring, limits because they will not risk the vulnerability of sharing deep feelings of joy or trouble or expectation? One woman who found the rejection of a friend of hers devastating said, "That's it. I'm not going to care that much anymore about anybody. I don't want friends. It hurts too much to invest like that and then have them leave you." But that's to surrender life. That's to surrender the possibility of knowing and growing together. Love is not love unless it has the courage to be vulnerable. Some time ago, a fellow by the name of Edward Dahlberg wrote an article about lost opportunities in the New York Times Book Review. He illustrated it with an encounter that he had with the famous author Theodore Dreiser. He said that he had always longed to know him, but when he thought about getting in touch with him, he always shied away. He was afraid that Dreiser just simply would reject him. He assumed that Dreiser would be engaged in some monumental work. He couldn't be bothered. Besides that, he thought to himself, what do I have to offer? If I telephoned him, he'd hang up and I'd be humiliated. Finally, he bumped into Dreiser on a social occasion, had a chance to talk with him for a few minutes, met him a few other times, as a matter of fact, but he always felt that somehow he was impinging on the great author's time. Then Dreiser died. A few years after that, a biography was published about Dreiser. Dahlberg bought it, read it, and he was astonished to read that at the first time they had met so casually, Dreiser's best friend had just died, and Dreiser said to his biographer that he had hoped that this Ed Dahlberg might become a good friend. Dahlberg read that line over and over again. He couldn't believe it. He said, "Good God, Theodore Dreiser needed me." We know how important others can be to us. Do we realize how important we may well be to others? How often we draw back before the risk of finding out, of making the move, of picking up the phone, of offering the hand. If our culture is rather short on deep friendship, I wonder if it's not because so many of us opt to play it safe. So real faith always has that quality. It's not just trust in the midst of the inevitabilities of life, it is the courage to risk in the name of relationship. Without such acceptance of risk, they often don't happen. And we don't happen. The acceptance of risk is finally the making of you and me. We need risk and adventure to grow and become all that we may be under God, with Him and for Him. For how many people is this business of religion, of prayer, of discipleship, of Jesus put off because it is a little scary, threatening, untypical of what we've become accustomed to? I'm not religious, some people say to me. Well, is it in your genes or in your fears? And we settle in safe and sane until we check out. But to truly live, we need to stretch ourselves, extend ourselves, grow ourselves, try new things in a measure of risk and adventure to be all that God wants us to be. Every year I live, I'm convinced that the waste of life lies generally in the love that we've not given, the powers that we've not used, the selfish prudence that will risk nothing and which, shirking pain, misses happiness as well. Mary Lou Carney tells of an experience she had just for Thanksgiving one year. And do you know what happened then? The first graders leaned forward, captivated by my pilgrim costume and my first-person account of the first Thanksgiving. Dozens of Indians came out of the forest, I said. After the story, I shared pumpkin pie with the class. One little girl commented through forkfuls, "That was some adventure you pilgrims had." I didn't bother to tell her I hadn't been around quite that long. But she went on, "I had an adventure last night." "Really?" I asked. "Tell me about it." "Me and my little sister walked all the way to the dry cleaners all by ourselves, and we had to go by this house where they have this ferocious dog." She stood up straighter. "We have adventures all the time. Last week we made brownies, and tomorrow we get to break the wishbone." She tossed her paper plate in the trash, skipped away, off to some new and scary adventure, no doubt. But driving home, I thought about my own life. What new adventures had I experienced lately? Everything in my life had come to seem so routine, so safe, so sane. After all, why risk that class down at the university? It might be beyond me. And sure, that offer to work part-time sounded good, but well, you know, it might fall through. And how did I know the new family on our block wanted someone to visit them? By the time I turned into my driveway, I knew the truth about me. I'd grown afraid to take any risk, afraid to have adventures. I was dependent upon what I knew. Did my fear feed on this narrow perspective on life? Had I become self-reliant and stagnant? And Abraham went out not knowing where in the world he was going. And what of us? You know, the reality is every morning as we rise to a new day and leave the house for whatever, we are in fact going out not knowing where we are going. And the question is whether we do it with courage and hope, as did Abraham of old, with faith. So let us throw off every weight and run with courage the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus on whom our faith depends, from start to finish. The poet, "Blessed is the spirit that strides the paths of life with joy, forward-looking, daring the day, challenging the night, seeking promise, not plan, hopeful, faithful, enthusiastic, whose laughter echoing down the valleys of time confirms that to walk erect and unafraid is prelude to the flight of aspiration." To such as these, the earthbound man looks up and says, "That one is free. He dares the journey. So may we." Amen.